Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Randy Horn, Deputy Commander at Cape Canaveral Air Station. Welcome to the rollout ceremony for our newly restored Navajo missile. We're all very pleased to have you here today. We have some very special guests with us this morning. Lieutenant General Dick Henry, U.S. Air Force, retired. Major General Jimmy Morrell, U.S. Air Force, retired. Mr. Jim Hoban, General Manager of Johnson Controls. And Mr. Keith Davidson and his family, he's a corrosion control specialist. Our speakers for this morning's ceremony include Brigadier General Randy Starbuck, Commander of the 45th Space Wing. Lieutenant Colonel Stan Holtzsnyder, Commander of Cape Canaveral Air Station. And Mr. Charles Murphy, former flight test engineer for the Navajo program. Could we all please rise for the arrival of the honor party? Please be seated. Our host today is Lieutenant Colonel Stan Holtzsnyder, Commander of Cape Canaveral Air Station.
Good morning, General Starbuck, Mr. Murphy, Navajo alumni, and guests. Welcome. On behalf of Detachment 1, 45th Support Group, Air Force Space and Missile Museum, the Museum Foundation, and the museum volunteers, thank you all for joining us today. It's fitting that we're holding this ceremony here in Hangar C. Hangar C stands as a monument to those early days of the missile program here at the Cape. But have you ever wondered where Hangars A and B are? They were actually built at Patrick Air Force Base as missile assembly buildings. But the Air Force shortly learned after initiating them that after assembling the missiles at Patrick, the bumpy ride over the road through Cocoa Beach was bad on the missile components, and they had to spend a lot of time on the pad up here at the Cape, and so they decided to build a third hangar, Hangar C here, and it was completed in 1953 after a short pause due to a steel shortage. 45 years later, we're still using this facility to refurbish winged missiles. It was here that the Navajo missile was refurbished. I'd say we got our money's worth out of this particular facility. Tradition holds that the walls on Werner von Braun's office, which is upstairs just behind you, still hold scribblings, formulas, and drawings beneath the more recent wall coverings. It is also held that Dr. von Braun would leave his office and go up the lighthouse to view launchings. To our Project Navajo alumni with us today, welcome back to the Cape. I hope you'll take the time to share some of your experiences with us so that we might continue the great tradition that you started here at the Cape. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Brigadier General Randy Starbuck, Commander of the 45th Space Wing.
Early booster shutdown. Exploded on pad. Ramjets failed. Destroyed at T plus 75 seconds. Ramjet flameout. Early booster cutoff. Ramjets failed to ignite. Control failure at booster burnout. 5 launches, 5 failures. So we canceled the program. The first launch was on November 6, 1956. We canceled the program on the 13th of July, 1957. 41 years ago today. By the time Sputnik went up in October of 1957, 6 Navajos had launched, 5 failures and 1 success. We would launch a total of 11, of which 10 were failures. In an ancient land of distant Arabia, a land of incense and moon magic, there is found the phoenix. This mythical bird was slim, sleek, swift, and beautiful. After winging her way through the clouds and sunshine for many centuries, the bird became tired. She built herself a funeral pyre of rare and fragrant woods. In the flames, the fire consumed the phoenix. However, since immortality was the gift of the phoenix, from the small heap of ashes that was left arose a beautiful young bird, shiny of wing and quick of eye. The Navajo Project, an effort to develop a supersonic intercontinental ramjet-powered pilotless bomber, was a failure in the sense that more than $300 million in 1950 was spent and no missiles were deployed. When ballistic missile funding became a priority, the Navajo's already in production engines were used. The more powerful G-38 engine was modified for use by Atlas, Jupiter, and Thor. Navajo's booster engine, heavily modified over the years, has boosted more than half of all U.S. space missions. Today, 41 years after the program was canceled, a fully restored Navajo rolls out. It's a revitalized symbol of the vision and commitment of our space and ballistic missile pioneers. Many of you are here with us today. Indeed, the visionaries can be proud of what they accomplished with the Navajo. The technology you developed while working on it made American military missile systems the best in the world for over 40 years. In just a few minutes, from right here in the oldest hangar on the Cape, we're going to make history by displaying a huge piece of Eastern Range nostalgia and accomplishment by rolling out a beautifully restored Navajo missile. In fact, we believe it's the last remaining Navajo in the world. Well, the last one above the surface of the ocean, that is. If it wasn't for the components of old Navajos resting in the briny Atlantic, many creatures of the sea wouldn't have had homes for the last 50 years. It's our pleasure and privilege that the permanent home of the restored Navajo will be here at Cape Canaveral. The Navajo has a special place in Cape history. There's no better place for the last one to be displayed. Research and development on the program started back when Moby Dick was a minnow, way back in 1946. The goal was to determine the feasibility of an intercontinental missile. Launched like a rocket, a G-26 missile rode piggyback on a booster, similar to the configuration today with the space shuttle. The booster carried the G-26 for the first 60 to 90 seconds of flight. The wing missile then separated from the booster and continued on the power of its own ramjets. These boosters and wing vehicles provided some of the most memorable and spectacular launch failures in Cape history. Furthermore, many Navajo launches were plagued with numerous delays. The failure to meet the times and the dates set for launch, coupled with the blow-ups, earned the Navajo the unflattering nickname of Never Go Navajo. The first Navajo launch at the Cape took place, as I said, on November 6, 1956. Launch Complex 9 and 10, where it was launched from, were bulldozed to make way for Minuteman Launch Complexes 31 and 32. Today, the concrete hardstand sits right over there, next to the road, covered in vines and largely forgotten. The last Navajo launch was on November 18, 1958. Over the Navajo's 2-year spans, there were 11 launches. Although 10 of these ended in relative disaster, it's not fair to say the Navajo program was a failure. The story of the Navajo is like that of the mythical phoenix, because out of the ashes of its launch mishaps arose the superior technologies that would be the foundation of our missile and space programs for decades to come. Although the majority of launches were less than completely successful, the vehicle earned a more dignified name, the Know-How Navajo. due to the cutting-edge technology it pioneered and the many spin-offs that resulted from its development. The legacy of the Navajo includes rocket engines that can be gimbaled or moved while firing to aid in controlling and steering the vehicle. The powerful Saturn V that took man to the moon had gimbaled engines. Today's space shuttle has gimbaled engines. Navajo is perhaps best known for the pioneering work done in the development of its guidance and navigation system. The inertial system developed for Navajo was used aboard the Navy's first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus, for the first trip ever under the polar ice cap in 1958. A total of 5 strategic missile systems use key Navajo guidance and propulsion technology. As a research and development program, the Navajo project was spectacular. We certainly wouldn't enjoy today's assured access to space if it wasn't for the Navajo. Several of the pioneers who worked on the Navajo program are here with us today. You gave the range some of its most memorable moments. Would you all please stand? Thank you very much. Also present is Mr. Keith Davidson, a corrosion control specialist under contract to Johnson Controls. Keith led the 2-year project to restore the Navajo we're about to roll out. Keith, thank you very much. Roll out the Navajo, we'll have a barrel of fun. That was the cue.
Our final speaker today will be Mr. Charles Murphy, former flight test engineer for the Navajo program, North American Aviation.
I'd like to express my appreciation for the opportunity to share a few comments with you on this occasion. There are a number of veterans, or as the signs that welcomed us here today called us alumni, of this XSM 64, G36, G38. There were a lot of nomenclatures here. That are here today, as you saw. When I was offered this invitation, I was extremely pleased, but then when I found out who was going to be here, I was quite humbled. I told Emily that it might be more appropriate to have somebody else make these remarks other than myself, because most of the people here were either my mentors or my superiors. Although she didn't tell me, I guess that since I happen to still be employed, she either decided I was the only one with a tie, or maybe she thought I was so young when I was on the program I didn't know enough to reminisce and keep you here all afternoon. At any rate, these veterans of the Navajo and others that worked on this and similar programs are the real pioneers of the space and rocket industry. This particular vehicle was ahead of its time in many ways, still had a vacuum tube clock in it. But it contributed, as General Starbuck noted, to the tremendous growth in our space technology. As a young engineer just out of college, I was absolutely awed by this program. It captured my interest in space and rocketry that hasn't subsided today, which is probably why I'm still working. The people that were on the program when I started had come from California for the most part. They came from Downey, where the vehicle was designed and manufactured, from Canoga Park, where the rocket engine was designed and manufactured and static test fired, from Anaheim, where the Auto Navigator was built, and from Edwards, where the X-10, the predecessor of this particular vehicle, was flight tested. The Autonetics division in Anaheim was a spin-off of the Auto Navigator lab in Downey, where that system was designed and developed. I was learning new things as a young engineer every day and new terminology. In fact, I had been working there for quite some time when I found that main stage cutoff wasn't one word. I'd like to share what some of the most memorable flights of this program were. There were 4 that stick out in my mind, and strangely enough, they do not include the last one, which I must admit I don't even remember. First of all, to recap the facts as I remember them, there were a total of 39 countdowns that we performed. And remember that I was in a data group, so I got a lot of data. 14 of those were for static test firing the rocket engines, and 25 were for flight. 8 of those resulted in an actual liftoff. The first flight, as General Starbuck mentioned, was probably one of the most memorable. It was on a fall afternoon in November. It was a beautiful day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, late in the afternoon. And as it zoomed into the atmosphere, we had a pitch rate gyro failure that caused a divergent pitch oscillation until structural loads exceeded the material strength of the airframe and prematurely terminated the flight. That was on the second countdown. The first flight took place on the second countdown. We did reach an altitude of 8,700 feet, got to about Mach 0.66, almost 7 miles down range, and almost 30 seconds into flight. The second flight that stands out in my mind was Flight 3. It happened in April of 1957. We launched on the very first countdown. Unfortunately, an inadequately defined engineering change caused a premature engine cutoff, and at the altitude of 4 feet, it settled back on the pad where it exploded and burned. It had a total flight time in ascent and descent of 15 seconds. Flight 5 was the third flight that I remember the most, and it's probably the one that contributed to the nickname. We did have 13 countdowns on this one, and I believe Test 21 might have been retired as a range test number after that particular flight. We did successfully separate from the booster, lit the ramjets, and reached a cruise environment of Mach 2.93. Unfortunately, we had a fuel control system failure that caused early termination. We did reach an altitude of 81,000 feet, Mach 3.09. We flew for 9 minutes and 26 seconds and got 230 miles downrange. The last flight that I'd mention is Flight 8. Flight 8 was in January of 1958. We launched on the second attempt. We got to a Mach number 3.03, cruising at 73,000 feet. We flew for 42 minutes and 40 seconds, got 1,060 miles downrange, and we're turning around at Puerto Rico to come back and land on the skid strip. Flight termination was caused by the loss of the left ramjet when the controller put a manual command to tighten the turnaround radius, and we lost the inlet pressure. This might have been the first and only totally successful flight that we had if it had not been for that. On behalf of the veterans or alumni of this program, I'd like to express our appreciation to the Air Force Space and Missile Museum and the curators who have worked so hard to preserve the heritage missiles that have operated from this range and ushered in the nation's space and rocket industry and capabilities. I know that this day will bring back many, many memories of events, as it certainly has for me. And for those of you who may have seen what that looked like before this restoration, there wasn't a lot to work with. It had been sitting out in this atmosphere for quite some time, and it's a remarkable job, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our ceremony today. Please rise for the departure of the honor party. Well, if they're not departing, then I have something to say. First of all, please enjoy the refreshments that have been provided by the Air Force Space and Missile Museum Foundation. And we would also like to have all the Navajo Project veterans gather by the missile for a group photo. Thank you.
I got here in January 1957, and I sat down at my desk and the boss came over and said, "Here's your first job." It was kind of interesting because I didn't never. I said, "What's the Navajo? And what's a submarine net? And where's the skid strip?" I didn't know where anything was, but it worked out nicely. We used horse race cameras, and had a whole battery of horse race cameras set up about 100 yards apart, and we had timing on each one, timing and distance between, and from that we could determine velocity.
You know, the engine technology was the basis for all of our missile development. The booster engine, Rocketdyne, was developed as a division. Then the inertial navigation system became a foremost system used in the Polaris program, as was mentioned, as well as the Nautilus. And of course, the ramjet technology was greatly improved because we never knew much about ramjets. We didn't have the computers that we have today. So we couldn't do variable inlet control, and that was one of the major problems on the Navajo. I was later on the B-70 program at North American, and that airplane had variable inlets, which would have been a great help if we'd have had it on the Navajo. So I think there was a great contribution that the Navajo made to almost every system that was developed at the Cape.
Here, Mr. Murphy was an integral part of the Navajo program originally. Aside from your original comments on the podium, sir, what kind of perspective can you give us on the Navajo? What was it like in those days being part of a pioneer program?
Well, obviously, we didn't have anywhere near the safety concerns that we do now. The memories of what we did in those days is really quite awesome when you think about the way we operate today compared to what we did in those days.
Right. I understand some of this ramjet technology is going to be used for some of the space vehicles of the future. Some of the new concepts are going to be based on some of this technology. Do you think that's valid?
Yes, unfortunately, the money that went for research in those days we needed for ballistic missiles. We did fly a couple of these flights in a program called Research in Supersonic Environment, the RISE program. But we didn't get a lot of data from those. But we were trying to capture not only the ramjet technology, but supersonic flight.
Both your and General Starbuck's comments reflected on a lot of this navigational and gimbal technology being applied. Do you think that that's valid?
Oh yes, all of the navigation systems used on the submarines today came from this. A lot of the spatial and inertial systems that we use on almost any program came out of this.
So, based on what's happened in history, you think the money was well spent?
Yes, I certainly do.
Program probably was a victim of inept understanding of what we were doing more than it was a bad idea. Oh, sure. Yeah. Trial and error. Yeah, but it worked. You really want to have airflow across the engine to keep it flying, to keep it going, and that was until you got supersonic. But to get one of these things... See, they started to put the insulation up here on the booster. Yeah, the phenolic, yeah. Yeah, that was about...